Good day, I'm Vincent Saxtetter, and this is the After the Age of Fire channel. This is episode 58, recorded on August 9th, 2026, and it'll be released 6 days from today on August 15th. The title of this episode is Where Will We Live? Each Region's Population. I'm talking about where the human race will live, say 100 years or 200 years from now. This is a prepping channel for you and your family line to help you flourish and thrive and reproduce, to prepare for the coming era. We're finishing an era of 250 years in which each 22 years the human race had about twice as much of everything, consumed about twice as much of everything as 22 years previously. So each generation had about twice as much as their parents. This era is coming to an end. We're in a transition right now from that era into a new era in which we'll no longer have these doublings going on, and instead we'll be consuming about half as much as we do now. In particular, half as much energy as we do now per person. So right now we consume about 60,000 calories per person per day. About 41,000 of that is coal, oil, and gas. Another 15,000 is food, fodder, and wood, and another 5,000 or so is from what we call renewables. And that'll come down a bit to about half of where it is now, to around 30,000. So that's roughly where we were in 1970 as a race. Okay. This channel has three main sections. The first one was about the past era of doublings and about how much energy we can get from each energy source available to us in the long term. So we looked over say food, fodder, and wood in all sorts of detail. We looked over coal, oil, and gas. We looked over the renewables again and again to see how much energy we're likely to be able to get from them, and that's how we came to around 30,000. Then we had a section of the channel about the transition and trying to see where we are in it. And then this is the second episode of the third section, which is about the coming era, what it will be like, how to prepare and thrive in the coming era, and then finally it'll be about this is an immense drama that the human race has been going through, the massive expansion, and then the end of expansion, and then something else. So what kind of story is this? Is it a disaster? Is it an adventure? Is it something else? So in the coming era, and if you want to know, I've spent 56 episodes preparing for this third. We're now in the actual prepping part of the content. And before getting into the prepping content, I spent 56 episodes, a whole year, from August 2025 to August 2026, telling in detail where all this is coming from. So I figure if you want to, I think it's better to speak softly and carry a big stick, and so that's why I spent a year building the big stick. But now we can finally start hitting at things. And in the last episode we talked about, the last episode was Land is Destiny. Land will go back to being the primary sign of wealth, because most of our energy and it will come from the land again, differently than it is now, but the way it usually was. And so if you want energy, you'll be having people, or you'll be working the land yourself. And the other forms of energy, the coal, oil, and gas, will be supplemental, and the renewables will be even more supplemental. And food, and therefore actually the produce of the land will be far more valuable to us than it is now. More than half of an average family's income will be spent just on food, as it was for almost all of history. Now we get the best harvests from our land and the land lasts. It endures better. It degrades less quickly. I mean, sorry, yeah, or maybe it even gets better if we give it the most personal attention we can. Okay, when you give it very personal care from people with agency who are able to make their own decisions about how to care for the land and what to do with the land, and who are very interested in the land. If you give them agency and responsibility and reasons to care about the land, then they will do. They'll make sure that the land gives them its best. Okay. But it requires a lot of personal attention that people will know every square meter of their land individually, and all the big trees and so on. Okay. So, so I said that this episode is about where we will live. Okay, and it'll be partly about the small scale things, where will individual people live, and then about large scale things, how the continents will be populated and so on. So let's just ask an obvious question. How much attention can we give to the land with 8 billion people, our current population? Actually, I'm using 7.8 billion because 4 or 5 years ago that was our population, and that's when I did this research for this particular. Anyway, 7.88 billion is about the same. Anyway, with that number of people, you can give one person to each square of land that's 130 square meters, 130 meters on a side. So each person in the world, if you parceled out the world's land, all of it equally between each person would be responsible for 130 on a side. But of course, that'll be a complete waste of energy, of our time, okay, because people should really concentrate on the land that gives the best harvest, the most calories, the most energy, and the most resources. There's no point in dedicating a person to a square of desert that's 130 meters on a side, because it's going to give you almost nothing, unless you have some special tricks up your sleeve, start irrigating it and so on. Okay, so what we really care about for getting energy and other resources is cropland. For energy, it's cropland, and to some extent forest, but primarily cropland. And so we have about 2,000 square meters of cropland per person. So that's a square that's 45 meters on a side. And out of that, about 2/3 of it is we spend on grains. We use about 2/3 of our cropland for grains, and we get almost all of our food energy from grain, or of course feeding the grain to animals and so on. So that would be about a 36 meters on a side square of grain cropland per person. Of course, the amount that you would give to individual people or in individual regions would vary widely depending on whether you are really growing grains, how good the land is. Some grain cropland gives 5 times or 10 times more than other grain cropland. Also, some people will be growing fruits and vegetables. Some people will be pasturing flocks, and some people will be, just overseeing seasonal products that just grow on their own, say chestnuts, and other people will be doing things that support that, living in towns, teachers and lawyers and people who, all sorts of other professions that support this structure. But so there will be all sorts of other considerations. There will be people that migrate, say in the deserts. You can still sometimes get something from the desert by migrating several times a year around the desert with your flocks. So I'll get into this a little bit more in a coming episode very soon. But overall, my main point is that the amount of land that you give to an individual person to be responsible for is rather small. It's much, the kind of care that we're talking about for the land is much more intensive, much more human based than modern factory farms, where you can have farms that are easily a kilometer on a side, and that kilometer is you know, you send tractors and so on across that square kilometer a few times a year, and then people walk through it now and then, but they don't know each square meter. They don't know each 100 square meters. But this is how you would get the best from our land. So overall, if you want to get the most from the land, you're going to have more people where the land is more productive. And that's so if you have a region of very good grain cropland, you'll have an awful lot of people there working with that land to get its best. Okay, if you have a land that's poor grain cropland, or that's better for fruit, then you'll have a different story. And if you have forests, and if you have desert or savanna or whatever, you'll have yet a different story. But overall, if we're in a world where easy coal, easy gas, and easy oil are no longer available, and where more than half of our energy comes from the land, then we will move to where the harvests are, because some land can give you a better harvest than other land. Some land is good for grains and some is not. Some is better grain cropland and some is poorer grain cropland. So we will redistribute our population, and I'm starting to get into the big story of where we're going to live as a human race, not just once you think, okay, we're going to live in the high productivity regions, then you can start to deduce things about say which country will have how much population and so on, which I'll come to in a second. But first I want to talk about how the population redistribution can work. Okay, one option is that you redistribute just by having people in high productivity land. Say you live in say Montana, where the corn harvests are extraordinary, or you live in in the Mekong River Delta in southern Vietnam, where the rice harvests are extraordinary, and those people just have lots of children until they have huge populations packed into these areas, doing wonderful things with the land. That's one thing. You just have more children, and then obviously if you don't, another option, however, is if you don't have enough children to match the potential productivity of your land, then you'll be in a situation where you have a labor shortage. It won't look like a labor shortage by today's standards, where we're used to just throwing huge tractors at everything. Okay, but in the new world where energy wherever it comes from, coal, oil, or gas, or from the land, or from renewables, is always expensive, then it will look like a labor shortage. Okay, it will be a labor shortage because you won't have enough people there to get the best out of the land. You'll be tempted to use heavy machinery and stuff, except for that you'll find that the heavy machinery burns too large a fraction of your harvest. And also, it simply, with heavy machinery, you can't pay enough attention to the land, and so it doesn't give you as good of a harvest. So in other words, modern tech can do extraordinary things with land, considering how few people you put on the land. Okay, but always, if you put more people on the land, you will get better results. So modern tech it's only when people don't want to live on the land, when they refuse to live on the land, that modern tech wins all the time. In the factories and so on. So suppose you have high productivity land, say the Mekong River Delta or Nebraska, and you don't have very many people on it, then you could reproduce and have more and more children. Or if you don't, then you're in a position where you will need help to get the land's best harvest, and you'll need extra hands, and so you'll start being very attracted to bringing people in to help. Okay. So we're talking about immigration, people migrating in to work. You can talk about temporary work, or you can talk about long-term work, but anyway, you will need hands to get the best. So that's two ways that you can readjust the population, that you can redistribute your population. One is to have more children, another one is to have some sort of migration going on. Okay. So when I talk about, for the rest of this episode, I'll be talking about population redistribution, and there will always be the option of just having more children for those high productivity areas. But it's only when people refuse to have more children, or for one reason or another, that migration becomes a certainty. Now, on the other side, the flip side is if your land is low productivity land and you have a lot of people there compared to the productivity, then one option is just to have less children, like so many countries are doing now, or to emigrate with an E, for people to leave. Maybe your children leave, and then or maybe you yourself and your whole family pack up and go. Okay, try to find some place where your work is needed. Now, having gone over the possibility of just having more children or less children depending on the land's productivity, or the second option is migration. Okay, I want to say that population movement can be combined with law and order. Okay, when I talk about migration and about here, I'm not in favor of just letting whoever thinks they have a right, or whoever wants to come in the border to let them in. Okay, that's a terrible idea. Okay, first of all, this transition into the coming era, which is driven in large part because easy energy will run out, the easy coal, easy oil, and easy gas will run out soon. It will take time. They're minerals, and so the process will take decades. Maybe 50 years or more. So there's time for considered action. It's not like we hit a brick wall and suddenly we have to instantly adjust our population. And moreover, there's some room for lag time, that even the population redistribution can run slower, run behind, decades behind the transition and from easy energy to expensive energy. Nonetheless, if you want to have migration with and you're going to if you want to pursue a strategy of allowing migration into your land, you still must accept and promote uncomfortable levels of migration, and you must accept the fact that I mean, as is the case in many places where today's population is a quarter of what it will be a couple hundred years from now, or a tenth, you have to accept that if you don't reproduce, that you're going to let in so many immigrants sooner or later, with law and order. You're trying to do it with law and order. That sooner or later you will be a minority on what you consider your own land. Okay, And if you don't do it with that kind of speed and that kind of acknowledgement that you're sooner or later going to arrive at being a minority, if your land is underpopulated, productivity compared to population, say 10 to 1, or in Montana probably right now it's 100 to 1, then you can be sure that sooner or later there will be 10 or 100 times more people, and they won't be you. They'll be people who have come in, unless you get busy about having children. If you don't do this, if you don't allow immigration, you're trying to do it with law and order, you're trying to mold the population so that you're still going to have, and hopefully you're going to pass on at least as much of your culture and your traditions as you can, and you're trying to insist that they embrace them. If you don't do this to an uncomfortable level, letting these people in at an uncomfortable speed, the dam will break sooner or later, and law and order will break down. Okay, so I'll come to that a little later in the episode about why you have to let people in relatively quickly. Okay. And what the consequences are if you don't, if you just stonewall things, if you let people in very slowly, too slowly, okay, and how law and order will break down if you do that, okay. But first, before I get around to saying that, I need to tell you how big the redistribution will be, because if you hear my arguments about law and order breaking down and so on right now, you'll think, okay, well, I don't think you'll take it fully seriously until you understand how big the redistributions are going to be, and until you start wanting to scream at me and say, this will never happen, the redistribution will never be this big, the world, my country will never, ever undergo this sort of transition. Once we get to that point where you want to scream at me about just, you cannot accept or imagine or the world that I'm talking about, then we can talk about what the consequences will be if you don't adjust your mind, and if your society doesn't adjust to what is really going to happen in the next century or two. So we can take a first stab, at what the redistribution will be by looking at, as you know, most of the world's food, fodder, and wood calories come in grain. So we can just look at where grain is being produced around the world, and we can say, okay, what would, and then we say population, people will redistribute to be where the grain production is, because that's where you can get the most bang for your buck for work done. More people on the grain cropland will give more calories, more energy, more wealth. Okay. So we'll look at that and we'll say this is a first approximation, of course, but it'll give you a rough idea, and I think it's the best indicator for figuring out where we're going to live, where the human race will live 100, 200 years from now. So right now, the worldwide average production of grain per person is about 390 kilos of grain per person. That's most of our calories. And that comes from about 36, a square of 36 meters on a side on average of grain cropland. So what I'm going to imagine, and remember this is just a first approximation, just to give a rough idea of where we're going, okay, and where the population is going. There's all sorts of complications and so on, and you can argue about details, but this will give the broad details, the broad story of where we're going to live. So what would the world be like if there were one person for each 390 kilograms of grain productivity. So you look at, say, the grain production in the United States and Canada, and you say, suppose that population redistributed until there were as many people in those countries as required to match 390 kilos per person, or one person per 390 kilos of grain productivity. So right now, actually the United States and Canada produce far more grain per person than that 390 kilogram total. Okay, so I'm saying, what if we gave the United States and Canada sufficient attention? Right now they're underpopulated compared to their grain production. Well, if we did that, right now their population is together 380 million people. Their population would go up to 1.2 billion. So 1,200 million people. Bear in mind that these two countries are on target to lose 20 million people by 2065 if you look at their reproduction rates. Okay. But if you were to match the population to the grain production, then, which was what you would need to do roughly in order to get the best possible harvest from that cropland, you would multiply the population of these countries by 3. And as it is, actually, the United States and Canada have some of the best cropland in the world, and they use far less of their cropland for grain than is done in other countries. For instance, in China and South Korea and Japan, roughly 88% of the cropland is used for grain, and in the U.S. U.S. and Canada, I think it's less than half. So if you were to adjust not just to how cropland is being used today in the United States and Canada, but the potential calorie production from that land, then you would take the population up to 2.5 billion, not 1.2 billion. In other words, if you match the population to the land in the United States and Canada, you would at least take the population up to 1.2 billion, and maybe up to 2.5 billion if you decided to use, as is done in many countries, most of the land for grains. So that's where at least 1 billion of the population of the United States and Canada is going to be at least 1 billion 100, 200 years from now, or maybe 2 billion. Now there's also a grain belt that starts in Poland and Ukraine and runs through Russia and southern Russia and Kazakhstan, and runs all the way to the Russian Pacific coast, around the border between Russia and North Korea. Okay, and this is high productivity cropland, grain. It's the grain belt, and let's think about Russia and the former Warsaw Pact, all those countries that were part of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact. Those countries now have a population around 300 million people, and the population would go up to 800 million people if you were to adjust the population to match the grain productivity today. So for instance, Russia itself, as it is now, has a population around 140 million, and its population will go up to something more like 400 million. Okay, so again, extraordinary changes. Australia, its population today is 26 million, which is very, very small considering it's a whole continent. The problem there is, of course, that the continent is almost all desert, and the weather patterns change from decade to decade. So it's it's unclear what its long-term productivity is or how much it can be relied on. But at least in recent decades, if you look at the grain productivity it's enough to justify a population of more like 140 million, not 26 million. Now we go on to Africa, which current population is 1.4 billion. Okay, and it's a huge continent. It has lots of cropland, but its cropland gives much poorer harvests. I think it's because they do very little irrigation and they use very little chemical fertilizer. At least that's a large part of it. So if you were to look at their actual productivity, then their current population, 1.4 billion, would be reduced to 560 million. Okay, so an awful lot of them would leave and move to, they would supply the shortage, the manpower shortage in Russia and in that grain belt, and in the United States and Canada and elsewhere. Now, I think actually, if they were just to start irrigating and using chemical fertilizer and running their land a little better, they could easily produce enough calories and enough grain to provide for that there would be no need for those to immigrate, those people to immigrate. But on the other hand, Africa is on target to get to 4 billion people a few decades from now, in which case 4 billion is still more than their grain cropland is like. It's still over concentrated. So you can expect people to be leaving Africa one way or another. They'll be needed. Now India and Pakistan, well, India's at 1.4 billion right now. It's on track to get to 1.8 billion in 2063 or something like that. 1.7 or 1.8 billion. But already it doesn't have much cropland per person. It does get good productivity from its land, but it's a relatively small subcontinent compared to the amount of people it has. So it would also be sending people abroad. India's population would go from 1.4 billion down to, as it is today, down to more like 900 million. So it would shed a half a billion people. And Pakistan's would go from 230 million down to 120 million. So these are the biggest changes that would happen. Around 160 million people would leave the Middle East, because the Middle East is essentially not a good place to grow anything, except for maybe dates, I don't know. So if you match people to the productivity possibilities, then once easy energy is no longer available, almost all of those people are going to leave. On the other hand, Mexico and Central and South America could accommodate another 130 million people, which is only like 20% more or something like that than what they have already, maybe 15%. Europe, now mind you, these countries, many of them have low birth rates, so they could probably accommodate more than 130 million people. Same story with Europe, leaving out the former Warsaw Pact countries, in other words, Western, Southern, Northern Europe. They could go from 450 million to 570 million, so they can take another 120 if they want to match the population to the land. East Asia, that means China, South Korea, and Japan, would be roughly stable at where it is now, around 1.7 billion. Okay. Of course, these places have the lowest birth rates in the world, in particular South Korea, but China and Japan with them. So if they want to maintain at 1.7 billion, they're going to need a lot of people to come in. In fact, it's a certainty. People are going to be coming in here. and and also Southeast Asia, which the population birth rates aren't so bad in many of the Southeast Asian countries. They'd be roughly stable at 700 million. So, to conclude all of this, in a world with 8 billion as it is now, or maybe 10 billion, let's say 10 billion, that's where we'll be a couple decades from now, then if you match the population to the farmland, okay, then the United States and Canada will expand from the current 380 million people to 2+ billion people. Okay, you can expect long term the population of the United States and Canada together to be around 2 billion people. Almost all of those in the United States. Canada doesn't have so much good grain cropland because it's just too far north. You can expect China, Japan, and South Korea to have a population of around 2 billion. And you can expect Africa to have a population of around 2 billion. These are the three big areas, the 2 billion person areas of the world. Then you have another tier, the 1 billion or so areas of the world. One is the Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, which together would have about around 1 billion. You'll have maybe 1.1, I don't know. Then you'd have the Russia and former Warsaw Pact countries, which would have a population again close to 1 billion, maybe 800 million. You have Southeast Asia with a population of maybe 700 million, still close to 1 billion. And you have South America with a population of perhaps 800 million. Okay, these are the 1 billion sized areas. Now I think maybe if you were to go about converting all of the Amazon into farmland in a systematic way, doing your best to take care of it, then maybe South America could accommodate considerably more than 800 million people. But on the other hand, I kind of doubt it. I think there are reasons why we've left that land the way it is. It's not just biodiversity, it's just hard to farm and hard to get anything from it long term. Then there are the smaller areas like the Middle East, where I've said most of the people will leave. I brought for the stands, the countries between Iran and India that end with stan and are a hot spot of population growth right now. Well, I already covered Pakistan and Kazakhstan, which are most of the population. And then we would have Australia, which would perhaps go from 26 million to 140 million. Okay. Now all of this is assuming a world with 8 to 10 billion people. If you take the numbers that I just gave you, that adds up to around 10 billion people. I'll talk about a little later, toward the end of the episode, we're coming closer to the end, about what if the population were larger or smaller, and what is likely to be the total world population long term. What if it's not 10 billion? Okay, but already this general structure will remain the same. You'll have the big three are the United States and Canada, and then Eastern Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea, and then Africa, and then you have some follow runners up, and the Indian subcontinent, Russia and the Warsaw Pact, Southeast Asia, and South America. Now I'll talk about why you have to let people in fairly quickly, uncomfortably quickly, as long as you're not, if your population is, like in the United States, where the population is now about 1/6 of what it's going to be, 1/5 or 1/6 of what it's going to be. Or if you're in Russia, where your population is 1/2 of what it's going to be, or less than 1/2. Let's see, what was it? Russia will go from between 1/2 and 1/3 of what it's going to be. So why you have to let them in if you're not going to ramp up your childbearing? It's because if you have less people, you're in a land that's blessed with a lot of good farmland, but you have less people, then you'll have a smaller harvest from that land, and you'll therefore, since you have a smaller harvest, and harvest in the coming world will determine everything. It'll determine how much money you have, your standing among your neighbors, neighboring provinces or neighboring countries or neighboring continents. It'll determine your ability to keep yourself and your population secure. It'll determine your power. Okay. So that's if you have too few people. You'll have less money, less standing, less prestige, less security, and less power. Okay. Now, so therefore, underpopulated regions will always find immigrants attractive, in fact, impossible to resist. And this will be even more so in the current situation, where many of these regions that are underpopulated are not reproducing. In fact, their populations are naturally shrinking, and are also, many of them, quite rich regions. So some of the reasons, I think the biggest single reason why you will want to import people is because those people will bring in a vitality that you don't have. I think many of the rich countries of the world are under the illusion that they still possess far more vitality than they do. They still think of themselves as thriving cultures and so on, but it doesn't take a lot of examination to compare yourself to your country 100 years ago, or the energy and inventiveness of your people compared to the energy and inventiveness of people. And if you were actually to go to some of these so-called developing countries and see what these people are up to. Anyway, if you want vitality, you'll import it. If you want energy, you'll get more energy the more people from your land, the more people you bring in, more wealth, more originality. There'll also be people if you're a richer country, there'll also be people in these other countries targeting you. Some of them will be scammers, trying to just scam their way in, and some of them will succeed. There will also be romantic and sexual reasons to bring people in. If you're from from a country where the average age is 45, and it's natural for the men and also women to be attracted to possibilities of romantic or sexual liaisons with people from other interesting countries and perhaps much younger. Or not so much about the romance or the sex, but if you're in a country where nobody's reproducing, and then if you just want to have a family, you want to have a woman or a man who's serious about marriage in some sense, or if you want to have some hope of having some children, like here in Korea, where the average number of children per mother is right now something like 0.75. So a man growing up here knows that or for that matter probably a woman, but that if he marries well, first of all, he knows that the women just aren't interested in marrying. So if you have an unusual man who's interested in marrying and having a family of 4, he can be sure that he's not going to find that woman here in Korea. Same thing with a woman. Okay, I don't know, maybe there's some blue moon possibility that it could happen, but it'll be very natural for the person to go and say, okay, well, if I want to have a family, if I want to have a few children, if I want to have more than 0.75 children, I think I'd better shop abroad. Okay. You should also be aware that when you bring in one person from abroad, that person will always do their best to bring in family and friends. So you're not bringing in one person, you're bringing in several or many whole families. Also, in many of these countries that are underpopulated and rich, immigrant labor will be needed for things like farming or nursing or construction. In many countries, and I remember when I most recently lived in the United States, that if you want a new roof put on your house, that new roof will be put on by immigrant labor. Many of the nurses have been imported. Anything that requires some physical work, some stamina, is and farming, is one of them. We'll need immigrant labor. Also housework, child care, care for elderly people. You want those services, you'll be shopping abroad. It's also natural to look for military people, military men from abroad. So, for instance, you're here in South Korea. Korea has one of the largest armed forces in the world, and it's in a permanent standoff with North Korea. That, in theory, a full-scale war could start any second, and it's just not having children. And so, how is South Korea ever going to avoid starting to import people for military reasons? You need strong, vital men to do it. And then, in many of these countries, the young people and the children or people of any age are just not willing to do physical work, like roofing a house, for instance. So there will be all of these reasons that will make immigrant labor so attractive, not just the farming, and just enable very hard to resist. So I'd like to talk about 4 paths that a country can take faced with this pressure to readjust its population to match its land. 2 of them end in collapse. One is law and order, and the 4th one is, of course, just have more children. So there are 2 paths that end in collapse. The first one I would call corruption. It's something where the country claims to control immigration but turns a blind eye to real immigration. So, for instance, there have been political choices being made in Europe and the United States in the last decades to let large amounts of immigrants in, often without checking much of anything, driven for political reasons. There's also something else that's been going on much more long-term in the United States: immigrant labor, sometimes temporary, sometimes long-term, sometimes legal, and sometimes illegal. Huge numbers of immigrants living with papers or without papers in the United States. Along with that, you can get schemes that involve slavery, apartheid, and segregation. I think all of those count under the corruption category, where you claim you're controlling the problem and you're really not. There's also organized crime, where crime syndicates, mafia, and so on find ways to get people in, and where you have porous borders, where on paper there's law and order at the border, but in action there are ways to get in. Okay, and all of these corruption alternatives, and probably many of them going on at once, will involve incremental destruction of the real border, of the real control over the border. So another option is to keep a firm boundary, just build a stone wall, and maybe you let technical workers come in if they're immensely qualified, and so on. but essentially let almost no one in and keep wages high inside of your own country. And I think this is the story of the United States from the 70s up through the 2000s, but not recently. Recently it's more the corruption. So the corruption was already in place. We already had lots of immigrant labor. But the problem is that if you do this, then your own workforce can't compete against the workforce in other countries, and so steadily companies will move their business abroad, and you'll lose competitiveness. Your economy will fail, and you'll move from manufacturing into services and finances, and then later into just DoorDash and fast food. And you'll steadily lose on the geopolitical stage. You'll steadily lose parity with other countries' status, and others will pull ahead more, and you'll become more and more insecure. Which has happened to the United States, for instance. And both of these scenarios, the corruption scenario and the firm boundary scenario, excuse me, both of these scenarios will finish with economic failure of the country, or being controlled and pushed around by other countries or companies, or by defeat in war, where your boundaries are violated once and for all, or by civil war. And whatever the outcome, and maybe several will happen more or less at the same time, the result will be open borders. Somebody will be dictating to you, saying you'll let these people through. A third option is the firm control, law and order, deliberately bringing people in but fitting them in, being very selective, as selective as possible, given that you need to let people in. You're aiming at a melting pot, hopefully, and you're trying to ensure that melting pot scenario by whatever means. And the means may seem very stringent, draconian, but you're doing whatever required to try to maintain law and order over a period of 50 to 100 years while letting lots of people in. Okay, and the fourth option, of course, is to have more children. I think actually the belief that you can have a country or a region that flourishes without having as many children as it, without having many children, I don't know about having, doing the absolute maximum, but without having many children, is a luxury belief. It's a fantasy. If you don't solve your problem with having more children, then you are in between a rock and a hard place, and the best option is to very deliberately and thoughtfully maintain law and order while doing uncomfortable things. The other possibilities I've already sketched for you. Finally, I want to discuss what about the total world population. I discussed what our regional populations will be if the total world population is around 10 billion, 8 or 10 billion. And overall, if it's different, if it's smaller or bigger than 8 or 10 billion, then we'll still have people distributed to match the farmland. So we'll still have roughly 20% of the world's population in the United States and Canada, 20% in China, South Korea, and Japan, 20% in Africa, 10% in the Indian subcontinent, 10% in Southeast Asia, 10% in South America, and 10% in the Russia and Warsaw Pact area, and smaller amounts in other regions. But so, if it's 20 billion, in other words, if it's 20 billion, not 10 billion, you multiply the numbers that I said before by 2, so the United States and Canada would have 4 billion, not 2 billion. On the other hand, if our long-term population is 4 billion, then you multiply the results by half, and so the United States and Canada would have 1 billion, not 2 billion. Now, what can we say about what the world's long-term population is going to be? And in my opinion, in the past, our population has always grown to match our food supply. And moreover, the people who don't reproduce, they just select themselves out, so they aren't here anymore, their children aren't here anymore. the people who do reproduce, they reproduce enough that the population grows and matches the food supply. And also, powerful people, if they want to have power, they'll need hands to work to get stuff from the land. And if they want to maintain their energy supply and their power, they'll need lots of people to work the land. So they'll be, in the end, not against having more, and they'll be for having more and more people. So let's talk about how many people this world could support. Well, at present, we get 15,000 calories per person per day for 8 billion people. And we discussed at length in several episodes earlier in this channel how much we could possibly get from our land, from our food, fodder, and wood. And with an awful lot of work, maybe a century or two from now, we could just get instead 30,000 calories per person per day. It would be an awful, and that's chancy. There's an awful lot of unknowns in there, but perhaps we could get up to 2 times more. Okay. Anyway, let's say right now with 15,000, how are we spending that? We spend about 2,400 calories of that on wood, 700 calories on fuel, biofuel, and then 12,000 more calories that goes, well, of that 12,000 that's food, about 2,700 ends up on our tables, we eat it, and another 9,000 or so goes to livestock and waste. So, in other words, out of the 15,000, 9,000 is not really of direct use to us, except for perhaps for feeding our animals. And we don't get many calories from those animals. It's something like 1/10 or less of those calories that we feed to animals come to us. Actually, it's less than 1/10. So what if we, instead of spending 9,000 of those 15,000 calories on livestock and waste, we spent only 2,000? So we eat meat less, we waste energy less, okay, waste food less. Okay. Then our personal per person consumption of food, fodder, and wood would be 8,000 calories per person. And with that, according to the arguments I've made earlier in the channel, we'd be able to supplement that with another 8,000 calories or so from other energy sources, coal, oil, and gas, and renewables. So the total would be something like 16,000 calories per person per day. And since we'd be only using 8,000 calories per person of food, fodder, and wood, then we could support 16 billion people. Okay, world population, 16 billion people. Easily done. Just have to eat less meat and waste less food. Now, let's talk about where that would place us worldwide compared to countries worldwide. Countries that right now have 8,000 calories of energy per person generally have a GDP of around $2,000 per person. And some examples are the Philippines, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Angola, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Myanmar. Together, that's probably already 1 billion people. If you had 4,000 calories per person, it would be more like you'd be down in the category of Nepal, Cameroon, Yemen, and Haiti. So less pleasant. So that's sort of, if you want to see what life would be like for the world, a world of 16 billion people living on 8,000 calories of food, fodder, and wood, and 8,000 calories of other things, you just look to those countries that I just mentioned, like the Philippines or Nigeria, and see how they're living. Okay. Maybe out of 8,000 calories of supplements, from 4,000 would come from from coal, oil, and gas, and 4,000 from the renewables. The amount of money required to purchase that amount of renewables, say wind turbines or solar, is about $1,000 per person. And that compares well to the GDP in these countries, which is 2,000 per person per year. So it's doable. You could live that way. So another option is we could double our harvest to 30,000 calories per person. Okay. I mean, and then we could split that among people, and if we got more productivity from our land, then we could even think about taking our population up to 30 billion while maintaining the 8,000 calories. Now maybe having more hands would help with doubling the harvest. Maybe we really could get to that sort of productivity. I'm not sure about the ability to build enough supplemental energy to match the 8,000 calories in that case. So overall, I'm saying is that we aren't at the limit of the world population. Even if you want to consider the impact that we're having on the environment, on our land, and so on, it's possible to live with the same impact or even less impact than we have now, while having double the world's population, 16 billion or more. And I think in general there's no need to worry that the human population will go extinct. There is a certainty that many of the world's countries right now are selecting themselves out, but some are not, and the people, the families, the regions, the towns, and the countries that don't select themselves out will thrive and eventually dominate. What's really happening is that the human race has always lived under a kind of a gravitational force called natural selection. If you reproduce, then your genes will continue, and if you don't, you don't. And we've lived outside of that regime, like going into space and not feeling gravity for 250 years, and we're just returning to land. The people who learn to walk, who regain the muscles the most quickly, they will dominate and thrive. And the people who learn faster how to live back in the normal gravity will do the best, and they'll thrive the most. So with that, I wish you a good week, and keep coming back. If you know anybody who's interested in this content, please invite them to join in. Do keep coming back.